These are potentially useful tools. However, an effective counterterrorism strategy requires a comprehensive approach, not just targeting the capabilities of terrorist networks, but an approach that includes everything from improved human intelligence, effective law enforcement, to upholding international law when a terrorist suspect is interrogated or incarcerated, and the tools of diplomacy and education. Most of the official public assistance that the US has provided to Pakistan over the last 5 years has gone to the security sector. Less than 10% of the $10 billion has been spent on development and Sorry, I'm getting over a cold in my voice still. Less than 10% of the $10 billion has been spent on development and humanitarian assistance. In education, only $64 million a year is spent on 55 million Pakistani children. That's a little more than $1 per child a year. Last year, when I had the opportunity to meet with poor rural Pakistanis, they affirmed their desires for basic human needs: shelter, food, health care, and they asked for one-room schools. We heard again and again that militant religious schools succeed because in most cases, they are the only alternative in a society in which 50% of Pakistanis are illiterate, and where in the tribal areas, the female literacy rate is as low as 3%. As Dean Hirsch said this morning, if you want to address global insecurity, educate girls. The US State Department noted in December 2007 that it's become recently clear to the United States that a purely military solution will not work in Pakistan. In this statement, the US says, what is required is a comprehensive strategy consisting of military and civilian, security, social and economic development, and political engagement. Most often, I believe, it's the process of policy implementation that fails us, not knowledge. We have the knowledge of what to do. We know that American interests cannot be met by global retrenchment, isolationism, or disregard for the needs of others. Knowledge is the starting point for reducing global insecurity. But then we need scholars, policymakers, citizens, and students to become the designers and deliverers of policies and practices that increase security and well-being rather than decrease it. Consider the European Union, a modern example of creative leadership and imagination that has successfully eliminated the European security dilemma, a tragic threat most dramatically illustrated by 2 world wars. The EU was founded by political leaders who were animated by a Catholic understanding of human nature, by the just distribution of authority in society, which they referred to as the principle of subsidiarity, and by reconciliation. European integration is based on an acknowledgement that states act to secure their own national interest. However, because of the interdependency of modern political life, the conditions for long-term peace and security can be cultivated, because the shadow of the future hangs over us all, facilitating long-term compromise and reciprocity. To make war unthinkable in Europe required a combination of both idealism and realism, an understanding of both the good and the evil that runs through human nature, and a vision for the right structures of governance, individual leadership, and creative imagination to propel long-term sustainable peace. The EU is an unfinished, albeit imperfect experiment and a work in progress. Europe's challenge, of course, is to extend well-being to the marginalized citizens who still live within the 27 member states, as well as to the Balkan neighborhood, and for the EU to continue as a global provider of security for other states and peoples, because it is in its moral, political, and social interest to do so. I'll conclude by focusing on the contribution that Westmont can make to address the global imperative of the 21st century. Much of what I focused on this afternoon is the bad news, the insecurity that faces the global community. The hopeful news is that we have knowledge about what to do. The global imperative is for enhanced security, and the central solution is better education. Sean Kay, a scholar of global security, offers we educators the following words of encouragement. Quote, all of these security threats have solutions if people are willing to engage them and seek creative approaches. Education is perhaps the central strategic asset in the 21st century. Education can defeat ignorance, which breeds fear, and thus helps to place various threats in perspective while facilitating effective problem solving. It should come as no surprise that Sean Kay teaches at a liberal arts college. Education is the key. Benazir Bhutto outlines a mandate for reconciliation in her new book, the final edits, which were delivered to her publisher only hours before she was later assassinated that very day. She calls for a strategy of people-to-people projects, an international fund for Muslim economic and social development, the equivalent of a new Marshall Plan for the Muslim world, with manageable, widespread, visible programs to deliver clean drinking water, rudimentary housing, and one-room rural schools. In her book on reconciliation, Islam, democracy in the West, Bhutto highlights the importance of economic and social development sustained by a stable and growing middle class, a strong compulsory educational system, basic health care, and the empowerment of women, where a flourishing civil society complements and sustains political and social and economic life. These lessons are not new. Again, they are the ones that social scientists have been teaching, the same best practices that have been identified by the World Bank, the United Nations, non-governmental organizations like World Vision, but clearly there is much work to do in effectively implementing these lessons. Bhutto concludes her book with a call for, one, an increased commitment among the countries of the West to provide more opportunities for educational exchange. Second, for a re-energized public and citizen diplomacy, again, based on the importance of education and diplomacy. And three, she suggests a new innovative idea of a reconciliation corps from Western societies, so that without, quote, further delay, to break the chains and cycle of poverty, extremism, dictatorship, and terrorism, we need to move on to the path towards true reconciliation. Westmont College is well placed to train future political leaders, clergy, citizens, relief workers, and innovators who comprise an educated, responsible citizenry able to respond to Benazir Bhutto's challenge of reconciliation, development, and security. Graduates who understand the global imperative of the 21st century, who have the energy and resolve to apply their knowledge to voting choices, to service on behalf of the poor, to corporate responsibility, to the communities where they live and work. Students who live out the imperatives of the Beatitudes in their personal and public choices, who realize that global Christian citizenship is a moral, ethical, and political obligation. In a global world of porous boundaries, interdisciplinary, experiential, and global education is indispensable to learning about our world, to developing appreciation, knowledge, and tolerance of diversity, to cultivating lifelong learners who are prepared to flourish in the midst of the most challenging and unpredictable circumstances. We need graduates and faculty who have studied and lived abroad, who have listened closely and communicated with others, who have experienced difference and can tolerate ambiguity. Genocide, poverty, human trafficking, climate change, and energy scarcity. These are problems that won't be solved by technological innovation, but by effective public policies embedded within a holistic and global approach to security, not national parochialism. Just as knowledge is not action, ideology is not innovation. We have the tools and knowledge to equip our students to think and act globally, not from a place of overwhelming despair, but from one of hope. In the final analysis, then, Westmont's commitment to rigorous empirical study, an energized vision for global Christian liberal arts education, with a blend of both realism and idealism, indeed is a significant strategic asset for the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. At this point, I would like to invite our three panelists to speak briefly from their individual perspectives, and the order will be Laura Montgomery first, Edd Noell second, and Allister Chapman third.
Following on Susan's talk, to achieve security of whatever sort requires us to live as though we have a stake in the lives of others. The fundamental commandment to love our neighbors as ourselves in such a way that Christ is made visible, and to paraphrase scripture, that peace and justice roll down like a mighty thunder. What greater call for a Christian liberal arts education? But who are those neighbors in a world where technology, goods, information, disease, and people traverse the planet at a pace previously unknown?